You're listening to the Rethreading Madness podcast, which airs live on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We are recorded and produced on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations around Vancouver, BC. I'm your host, Bernadine Fox, and this is the show that dares to change how we think about mental health. Welcome to our show.
When I've never been further from knowing what the hell I'm gonna do, when I can't seem to find my way under or over.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and today I'm speaking again with Ninu Kang. She's the Executive Director of EVA, and we recently had a conversation about how COVID had impacted on domestic violence victims. Ninu and I wanted to come back, and we agreed to enter into a conversation about reconciliation, what it is, what it means for us, what we have done, where we make mistakes, what more we need to do, all with a view and agreement that we aren't going to do it perfectly and we may embarrass ourselves. It was purposefully off the cuff, without rehearsal, willing to call each other out or be called out, willing to learn and to be humble and vulnerable. I hope you find this conversation useful. I know I did. Ninu, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be with you again, Bernadine.
I wanted to, thank you for the interview before. It was a wonderful interview. I'm so glad you're the Executive Director of EVA. It's clearly in very good hands, and I'm pleased about that, having a history of being a battered woman myself. So thank you very much for that work you do.
Thank you, Bernadine. That's very kind.
I really wanted to enter this conversation on reconciliation by identifying who we are and where we are positioned in this discussion. For me, I'm a white person. I'm a descendant of settlers. And when I say settlers, I mean just that. Both sides of my family came to North America to take advantage of the government's promise of land, which was being given away so long as settlers erected buildings and farmed it within 2 years. My great-great-grandfather, for example, was given land in Iowa, which proved unlivable, then in Pipestone, Minnesota, then on part of the Nez Perce Reserve in Idaho, and eventually in South Fork, Saskatchewan in Canada. I was born in Calgary, in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta, but now live on the unceded territory of the Squamish and Halkomelem-speaking peoples. I am a bisexual, intersectional feminist who lives with various disabilities, one daughter who is part Hungarian and another who is tsuut'ina. I have 5 grandchildren who are tsuut'ina and Tahltan, and I'm connected to extended family on tsuut'ina, Alberta. Mm-hmm. So I was hoping that you could also tell us who you are and how you come to this issue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing, your positionality in relation to living on these lands. I'm originally from India. My family immigrated here in the 70s. My father came as a visitor, liked it, and was able to get status and bring us over. So for the longest time, my identity was that I was an immigrant to these lands, and then my identity further, for my own sanity, was that I'm an Indian from India,
right?
And I am, and then the terminology that was in the world, like in Canada, was Indo-Canadian. So then there was this hyphenated Indo-Canadian. And again, these were terms that were out there for me to wear. They weren't created by me, but they were there for me to wear and take on. Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting because I have been doing this work in the nonprofit world, in the social services sector, and more specifically in the immigrant settlement and anti-violence, gender-based violence work, for 30 plus years. And I identified as an immigrant. I'm, you can't see me, but I'm visibly brown colored woman walking in the world. And so all my life I knew that I wasn't from here. You know what I mean? I was from somewhere else. And it's not until recently that I really, in the past 10 years or so, that I have really started to understand my relation and my position to Indigenous people of these lands, that I've really started to talk about the language of being a settler here. So, what does it mean to be a settler onto these lands, coming from elsewhere, on unceded territories, unceded land that was stolen? And what's my privilege on that land? What is the privilege that I assumed on this land? So, I'm giving you a long version of my identity, but I wanted to share the kind of the transformation of my own relation to these lands, because certainly in the early years of being an immigrant, I just thought, well, I'm just like anyone else who came to these lands and is with the goal to succeed and make money and make a good living and eat well and live well, kind of an experience. And so, I think certainly the process of truth and reconciliation, as I watched that unfold, and I understood more and more about, the colonial systemic policies around residential schools and the impact of that, and the current impact, not just past and generational impact, but the continued systemic impact. I started to, again, really go into a place of humility and, my own internal journey with what reconciliation means to me and what's my responsibility to take action, to be an ally, and to be, not only be an ally, but how to be an advocate, like how to find any space I can to talk about the importance of reconciliation.
One of the things that happened in my family recently is that we've had a young man pass away from a fentanyl overdose, and he was a land defender up in, and I'm not gonna say the name right. It's up in Wet'suwet'en, something. Is it? I didn't say it right, I'm sure. But one of the things that he has said is, to us who were white, he said, you need to weaponize your privilege. And I think that's a bit of what you're talking about, is how do we take what privilege we have to ensure that we're not participating in continuing on the racism, the systemic racism that is so prevalent in our societies.
Yeah, I mean, today I'm talking to you, and I have the privilege of, EVA offices are on the unceded, traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And, I use land acknowledgement a lot when we speak about these things, and even, how to do land acknowledgements, like what goes through our psyche, what goes through our mind when we do a land acknowledgement. I mean, that's also been my own process of learning as well, right? Because that's a protocol like many Canadians have started to take on. Okay, you come into a meeting space or a conference or something and you do a land acknowledgement. But, one thing I've been learning a lot from, Indigenous leaders and Indigenous, knowledge holders is what it means to be on that land. What it means to be an invited or uninvited guest onto that land, and what are the local protocols of the peoples of those lands, and taking that time and effort to think about that, and think about that in terms of our own journey of reconciliation.
Yeah, I've been hearing people talking about how land acknowledgements has become something that people do, but they don't do it from the perspective of somebody who is Indigenous. And that's what you're talking about, is that there is a whole importance in why that's done, and why it's important, i.e. recognizing whose land you're on and whose territory you're on, and acknowledging that in a way and being grateful for that as well. that you are this person, you are a guest in someone else's place. It's the same as if you were a guest in someone else's home.
Mhm.
For those of us who are white, I guess I should say that. I don't want to speak for you, but when we are a guest in someone's home, we acknowledge that and we thank them, and we sometimes give them gifts for inviting us into their home. And on some level, that's what I see. But I also see that there are a lot of people who do performative allyship. I guess that's what it's called, where it's become sort of a political correctness, I guess is what I want to say. I
Mhm.
married an Indigenous man at the age of 16. So when you were immigrating here in the 1970s, I was living on a reservation. And I'm sure you know, as I do, I don't know where you immigrated into, because certainly Canada's big.
Mhm.
Excuse me.
It was Victoria. Yeah, just
Victoria.
one.
Well, I
Mhm.
was doing this in Alberta, which is still one of the most racist provinces in Canada, as far as I'm concerned. And, I've watched over the years, I'm much older now, I'm certainly way past 16, and I've watched the progression of racism from the place where, when I was walking alongside of him holding hands, we would get spit on, to this tacit form of racism isn't okay, and so you can't say things out loud, but people still thought them and they still acted on it, and people, sort of systemic racism comes out of all of that. But people still didn't employ them. They didn't allow Indigenous people to rent housing from them. They didn't necessarily break bread with them. And so racism was more out there, but I wasn't getting spit on anymore. To
Mhm.
now, which is this other, in my mind, another odd form of racism where people are endowed with political correctness and they have all the right language and all the right words. But it's become sort of cringy kind of instead of ignoring and pushing away and trying to deny their culture and their traditions, it's become this thing of appropriating their culture and their traditions in an attempt to, as a white person, assimilate native culture into them. I don't quite understand it. I just know that it comes off as this do you know how Paris Hilton had those chihuahuas and they kind of
Mhm.
became her accessory? It
Mhm.
has that feel to it, and I
Mhm.
certainly am not saying that Indigenous people are chihuahuas. It's just that some people out there are over doing it in some
Mhm.
capacity, and on some level that's okay. I mean, I'd rather they be overdoing it and going this way of behaving in respectful ways, in at least, than doing what they were doing before. At least they're trying and everything. But I'll give you an example. My ex came out to visit and we have a child. We
Mhm.
have 5 grandchildren. He was here for a few days. A friend of mine knew that he had come and was one of these people who is over endowed with political correctness and, is sort of treating everybody who's Indigenous as being a guru or a shaman or.
Mhm.
And so I said my ex was around, and she said, "Oh, what did he say?
Mhm.
Do you know what I mean?" And I don't even know how to answer that because, we talked about our kid, we talked about our grandkids, we resolved some things from the past, but he
Mhm.
wasn't here to give me, lessons in native culture or
Yeah.
tradition or anything. We were just having a
Yeah.
visit. And that's the thing that I start to cringe from. And I cringe because I worry on the back end of that is going to be a lot of repercussions for Indigenous people.
Mhm. I mean, you're making so many points that certainly I've been thinking about a lot as well, as to that when you think about being an ally, when you think about that, look, I want to do personal reconciliation. That is me, my body, my mind. What does that mean for me? To sort of really understand how I've benefited
Mm-hmm.
from the colonial history and the current colonial discourse, and that's my personal journey. And then also your professional and your community, like living in your community, like what does that mean? What does it mean for me to be the executive director of a provincial association and taking my team through that, but also feeling some sense of responsibility to, bring some of these processes for our membership, like our nearly 300 members across the province. So there's kind of like, I always sort of see them as two different processes. There's my own self, like be honest with myself, what's
Right.
really going inside my body and my mind. And then the other is things that, we're trying to move the communities and move organizations forward. And so I think the first, the personal journey. So I think asking oneself, and I'm talking about myself here, I am constantly asking myself that what I'm doing, is it performative, and is it just to make myself feel better, that now I am doing something that is right now in the Canadian discourse. It's about talking about, being an ally to Indigenous communities, doing reconciliation. Like, am I really, really feeling it? Am I really giving something up, right? Or is it just, I have the language? Is it just that there, I have a positionality in the world, which is part of the colonial structure,
Right.
executive director. So all those things, right? And so to me, the inner dialogue is super important, because for me, that dialogue, I never want that to end in my brain, because it's like I'm constantly challenging myself. And then there are times where I'm saying to myself, like, Ninu, that come on, be honest with yourself. Like I'm saying that to myself inside my mind sometimes. It's like, really, that what you're thinking isn't really giving any of your privilege up.
Right.
So that conversation, without getting too kind of, psychodynamic about it, but that internal conversation, I think, just has to be lit and on all the time.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
you introduced this show by saying, look, we're going to kind of talk about this, and we're really going to talk about all the, the good, bad, and ugly. Like, we're trying, but we're going to make mistakes. And so to me, that's part of it, is constantly saying that you're not always going to get it right. In fact, most likely you won't, but each blunder you make, or each time you challenge yourself, hopefully next time you'll do it a little bit better and you'll do more. But I want to just play the other side of that coin, which I've also, as a conversation I've had with myself, which is that it's also not good enough to say, oops, I made a mistake. Oh, well, I'm trying and I'm just going to keep trying. I also feel like you need to have some goalposts. Like, you need to say to yourself, like, look, I am going to commit to doing this, and I want to get this done by the end of the year or in 6 months. And that is, whether it's about building a relationship within community, or whatever our action, our personal action is, like, we need to hold ourselves to account. Because my worry is that the first conversation I talked about inside my brain, which is sort of like, oops, I'm doing my best. Yeah, like, of course I care about reconciliation, and, and I can be very self-righteous with myself. I can say, okay, I'm doing a lot. So to me, I think the goalposts are really important. Like, where you should ask yourself, well, what did you do this year? Like, what's the action? Just having an internal dialogue about it, and just, saying, okay, you're going to do the right thing, is just not enough. Because if at the end of the year, end of 6 months, end of the month, whatever, you really haven't proven to yourself that you've actually taken any action, to me,
Right.
that's a cop-out.
And it's easy to do that cop-out in our social constructs out here, right? Because we kind of live on the surface of what we say and how we present and what is our brand, and all of that stuff, which may not be EVA brand. I mean, you know what I'm saying, but marketing, people, they market themselves in the same way people market their products. And so it's really easy to be on the surface. And what I hear you saying is that reconciliation really is about authentically sitting in yourself and recognizing, what did I do here? And how do I fix it? Not what did I do and oops, but what do I do and how do I fix it?
Well, I mean, the other part, Bernadine, I wanted to share with you, as being a woman of color, I spent so many of my years, even my professional years, identifying as a part of an oppressed group. And so because I'm a woman of color, because I identified as an immigrant, and so in our professional discourse, immigrants are kind of put in this bucket
Hmm.
of a group that is, experiences some form of oppression. Therefore, they're a special group that you should pay attention to, similar to group with, people with disabilities, indigenous people, LGBTQ, and all of that kind of stuff. So it's like we are in one bucket, and there's a bunch of other buckets of groups that are oppressed. Well, what I found, what happened to me, and it probably, it's possible it happens to other immigrants or other groups, is you become very fixated with your bucket of oppression.
Mm.
And so what happens is, and I can tell you for many, many years, I saw the bucket next to me, which was, the oppression of indigenous people. But I was over here in the bucket of oppression of immigrants and refugees and newcomers and women of color and all that.
Right.
And so what happens is that also limits us, because in my case anyway, is that you get really fixated on, focused on getting, the rights and freedoms of my community, my culture. And I think that is also a big problem, because what happens is sometimes newcomers that come into this country, who also have many barriers of, employment, settlement, and all of those kinds of things. What happens is this country here, because we're not talking about the truth of what happened during colonial processes and our whole colonization, and as a result, what happened to indigenous people and the intergenerational trauma and the current trauma, because that's not a really, it's in the public eye. I mean, it wasn't even hardly discussed in schools when I went to schools. We're just starting to get some of that knowledge and information into schools. What happens is, I think newcomers that come in here, they don't even know. They just think Canada, I mean, I'm making a wide brush comment here, but I guess I'll say for myself, I just thought these lands belonged to white people.
Well,
Canada
and the interesting part about, as you're talking, I'm sitting here realizing I don't have a bucket.
right?
I
Well,
don't see a bucket. If there's buckets in front of me, none of them are mine, which is an interesting colonial view I'm getting right here, sitting right here, right now.
wow, yeah, that's
So, yeah.
well, and that is also, I think, that's a colonial mindset as well.
Yeah.
Is there's already an assumption that if you are white, just white,
Yeah.
if you're just white, you are part of the mainstream, the language we sometimes use, that you're the mainstream, you're the dominant culture, and therefore, you are not invited to look into your culture.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're
And we
not.
don't.
And you're not invited to look at the intersectional positionality within whiteness, right? So,
Right.
poor women who live, under the poverty, and single moms and others. What happens is we don't go deeper,
Mm-hmm.
right? It just becomes about us and them.
Yeah.
I think it was very interesting. I think there was a moment when you said, you don't have a bucket, and we were talking about, myself for many years have seen myself as an immigrant woman of color, and I personally find that for me that has restricted me from really diving into understanding or even needing to learn about the colonial past of our lands, because you get really drawn into that. You get drawn into the fact that your own community is also struggling.
Mm-hmm.
I spent many years supporting newcomers and immigrants and refugees, or at least talking and thinking about, the barriers that newcomers face into this country and settling into this country. And then even when I was doing work on gender-based violence, just from my own positionality, and because I have, a language, Punjabi and Hindi, of women from India. So then I became, of course, even more narrowly looking at issues of South Asian women who experience gender-based violence, domestic violence in particular, intimate partner violence. So it's it's just a reflection as we're talking that how divided we are in these silos, in these buckets, for lack of a better word, and when really the mainstream issue, if I can say that, should really be everybody's general understanding of the history of these lands, our colonial history. Like, when really that should be the foundation of our identity.
Say more about that.
Right?
Well, say more about that. What does that mean?
Well, I'm thinking when I came here in the 70s, what if I learned right away, as soon as I arrived here, that there are people from all over the world who've come to these lands, but these lands are lands of the, first peoples of this country, and that what if when I came as an immigrant, I learned that we have a dark history of what happened when early settlers came here, and how the nation building of these lands systematically, not only oppressed, but, eliminated, genocide is the word that's often used in this discourse, of the first peoples of these lands. If I knew that as an immigrant, and I had a sense of responsibility to be part of that knowledge and education, I think I would see myself here differently. And maybe I wouldn't have even felt so oppressed, because maybe I would have thought, all right, well, these lands, the people of this country that I've immigrated to, are humble. And are apologetic for what they've done, and are taking action to reconcile. And if that was happening when I first immigrated here 50 years ago, I think my relation to reconciliation would be different. And I don't know if I'm being vague about that, but I don't know. It seems to make sense in my brain when I talk about it, but I don't know. Does that even make sense, what I'm saying? Or does it sit with you? Or I wonder if the listeners are thinking, what is she talking about?
When you're talking about people being humble and that, are you talking about Indigenous people, or are you talking about the colonial people?
No, I'm talking about the colonizers, the rest of us, the non-Indigenous people.
Do you feel that they were humble?
No, I don't think that humanity was here. I don't think, when I came, like I said, I thought that this was the land of the white people.
Yes, that's what everybody was told. Absolutely.
And we were not taught, it's not only that we weren't taught Indigenous history. That's a simple way of saying it. We weren't taught the true history of colonization of these lands. I think that's the history that was missing.
Yes. And so, being a white kid that grew up in Alberta, racist Alberta, I can tell you what I was told about First Nations people. We were told that the white people came here and helped this land, that the First Nations people were savages and uncivilized, and that our job was to help them become more civilized and more normal. Certainly the colonial idea being we're right, they're wrong. And that the residential schools were helping people so that they could go to school and they could learn. And that, their drug addictions or their alcoholism really was because they were not trying hard enough, basically. That's, basic parameters, the everything you think you were told around racist ideas around First Nations people I grew up in that community. That's what I was told. Now, how I became the person I was out of that, I'm not sure, because by the time I was 12, I was already saying that's not an okay thing to say. You can't call them all drunks. They've been harmed. I don't know how or where I got that information from, but I was really clear on it. So but I look back at that time, and it's, I can see when people say, oh, no, the residential schools were helping these people. I understand that, because that's what we were told. It was wrong. They weren't helping, of course. They were harming, greatly harming. And the whole idea of civilizing First Nations people is ludicrous, because the more I get to know about First Nations cultures and traditions and the way they lived with the land, and all of that was so much more civilized than we white people have ever been in our whole friggin' lives. I mean, even up to this day, we have not reached that point of civilization that they lived with and still do.
Well, one of the things in my field, anyway, that I hear over and over again from Indigenous leaders and knowledge keepers is that this was a matriarchal society.
Mm-hmm.
The colonizers came and brought patriarchy here.
Yes.
And what came with patriarchy was violence.
Yep.
And it was violence against women and non-binary folks and anyone that was different than a man, a self-identifying man. And so that hierarchy within our social systems, that I've also heard that the early settler colonizers would not even meet with the matriarchs of the indigenous lands where they were negotiating or talking and meeting. And that it was the matriarchs that the indigenous matriarchs within those communities, they would have to send one of their male counterparts forward, because the white men would not talk to the leaders, the true leaders,
right,
within those communities. And so I think when we look at gender-based violence, and we look at, horrifying statistics, like 1 in 3 Canadian women will be sexually assaulted in her lifetime. And we're talking like cross cultures, class, everything. And then you think about the violence that's attached to a culture that was embedded here. And you spoke about this earlier, because you've had much more insight and closeness to the Indigenous culture through your relationship. But you talk about the richness. I think it's beyond richness of land. It's the richness of how families were valued, how elders were valued, how children were valued, and how relations to each other and to land and to the all nature. And so, it's probably one of the, biggest tragedies of our nation here, that we lost all that. Even if we chose to come from other parts of the world here, what would the world be like if we didn't destroy that? Could we still not have come to these lands and coexisted and had created a kind of a multi-ethnic, diverse identity country, and really embraced the cultural values of the Indigenous people? Like, what would this country look like now?
I know, that would be so amazing.
How would your life and my life be different?
That makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck.
Right.
I come from Irish, Scottish, English backgrounds. So, given what I know about historically about people who came from the UK to here to colonize, I'm not sure they could have ever done that without several millennia of self-reflection and evolution. White people, and I can say this because I'm white, is they are out to destroy, to consume, to modify, to kill. That is where they perceive their ideas of powerfulness, So it's like asking them to go completely turn around and be very, very different. And so I understand from that perspective. I can understand how they came here, they saw what they saw, and they just and First Nations people basically opened their arms and said, how can we help? How can we be here? And white people just simply ran over top of them and took and destroyed and consumed and modified and did what they did, thinking that they had a right to do it because that's how they think. And that still happens. I still see it existing now, even though we've gone, quite a ways into reconciliation, it's still, systemic racism is still there. It's still happening on a daily basis to people.
Well, and systemic racism is structural racism, right? Because it's the structures that are created, like I said, that's based in patriarchy, that is based in, someone being better than another. So people's self-identities and the way we think, if you think about a colonial path and sort of this Eurocentric way of thinking, it is very much about me and you. So right. Between you and me, who is the better host? Who is the, who has the potential to get a promotion first?
Right.
Who can do what to have a higher salary?
Right.
Who, how can between you and I as two women, what can I do more than you to get one step above you? And so it's a way of thinking. It's a way of moving in the world. Where, everything that, I have been exposed to by Indigenous knowledge keeper or leaders who I've had the great privilege of listening and really taking in that knowledge and trying to incorporate it into my thinking. Everything that I've heard is really about, it's communal. Mm-hmm. It's about community building. It's about, I'm elevated if you're elevated.
Absolutely.
And it's about, I'm better because my community is better, and I am going to contribute my bit because I trust everybody is going to contribute their bit. So it's a different way of thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, as you know, I come from India. I was born there, and I was 10 when I came here. And ironically for me, I came from a country that was colonized by the British. And it was only 25 plus years when India gained its independence from the British. And so there was a lot of internal uprising that finally convinced the British to leave India. And so I find that ironic, coming from a country where I very well understood what colonization meant. My father understood what colonization meant for India, and yet we would move to another country and not even be really curious, understand what this nation, what the history of this nation would be in relation to colonial past.
Interesting.
Right? So it's just it's an interesting self-reflection, and one that I'm not super proud of, but it took me a long time to really see myself as someone that continues, because I've benefited from how the systems here, you talked about structural and systemic racism. Well, it's that structure that allowed me as an immigrant who was able to, my father, my mother were able-bodied, they were able to, even though they did labor jobs, but they were able to make enough money to put us through school. And therefore I learned the settler language. I learned to think the way through university houses. And hence I benefited from that. So I continued to what we would call is succeed in my career and so on, financially and otherwise. So these are, I think it's just it's fascinating. I mean, my brain goes in so many places when conversation like what you and I are having.
I'm so grateful for this conversation. You're listening to Rethreading Madness. I'm Bernadine Fox. I'm talking with Ninu Kang, the Executive Director of EVA, about reconciliation and what does that mean personally and professionally for both of us. Um, you talked about learning to think. I one point I thought that my racism was taught to me in my family, and since I was only there until I was 16, I spent more time being away from racism than I was exposed to it. And then it took me, like you, it took me a long time to realize, no, racism happens around me every day, all day long. And it's, I realized that this process of undoing racist ideas that I have absorbed just by being in the culture is probably going to last my entire life. I will have to always question what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. I'll give you an example. I teach drawing when I'm not on the radio, and I had a person of color in my drawing class. Several people of color, but in particular, this person of color. And at some point, I wanted to show her something, and so I asked to take her pencil and explained it. But then I realized I stood back a bit, and because everybody else was drawing, she was the only person I talked to at that point. And I wanted to really check inside, did I do that because she was a person of color? Did I not do that with the white people? Did I just, single her out? And I was able to process it and I had to watch myself as I did classes after that. Who am I doing this with, and why am I doing it? And is it the same? And ultimately I came out with the realization that, yes, it's not that she was a person of color. I do the same thing with white people as I do with her. But that process is the important process to always, and I find I do this all the time. I've done it since I was a kid, to just check, why am I doing this? Why do I have this idea? Do I have this idea because somebody told me that First Nations people aren't able to handle money, or do you know what I mean? Like all of these ideas you end up having that aren't written down somewhere, that you can have a checklist, but you have to, constantly question yourself and question your motives and question your actions. The older I get, I think I mentioned this to you before, the older I get, the more I become mistaken for being First Nations. And that only happens on the West Coast. It does not happen when I go to Alberta, because I don't look like the First Nations people in Alberta. I do look like First Nations people here. And it's so common. It happens all the time. So I got a speeding ticket. And when I went to dispute the speeding ticket, I asked the cop to send me all her notes. And what I got back was a copy of my ticket that, after she had given me the top copy, she had written Native on the ticket itself.
Wow.
And that spoke volumes to me about how many ways that what we look like, who we look like, impacts on what people do. I won't go into what happened in court other than the fact that I won and the ticket was thrown out. But when I started to get it, that this thing about looking Native, I started to realize all the ways that I was dealing with systemic racism as a white person. And I don't want to imply that on any level that my experience is anything like what a First Nations person goes through, because I have a DNA test that I can wave around and say, see how wrong you are here. But it's everywhere. It's in how the dentist talks to you, and how a doctor will decide whether or not you have an illness or you're just making it up, or how people will treat you if you have a drink, or do you know what I mean? Like, it's constant, it's every day, it's just ongoing all the time. And I get it from that how life would just sort of beat you down every day, all day long, if you're First Nations in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. And you shared a little snippet of your experience, and even that just gives a little window. But I can't even really imagine, because even if I take my experience as a young kid from India, back in the 70s, going to school,
Mm.
nobody, sort of like not having any friends because, we were just few brown people in our school.
Right.
But I came home after my school was over and I felt kind of alone and alienated. But I came home to a warm house with loving parents who validated for me every single day that it's okay, but life is going to be better here than where we left it.
Right.
And so the cocoon that I lived in, that was very warm, caring, and comfortable, even that experience I cannot equate to what you're saying about the indigenous racism that is embedded in the bones of this nation, and through colonial, systemic and structure. Like I mean, I'm sitting here in Vancouver and I see all these high rises all around me here, right? And we are here. All these buildings are surrounded by Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations lands. And I often think, this is one of the most beautiful little piece of land in Canada. And there is, there's nothing here that shows me as I look around that has anything to do with Indigenous identity. And the peoples who must have lived here, who must have intermarried between the nations, and who must have, traded even just from, Cole Harbor here over to the English Bay, or whatever that looked like here. And so that is so in the bones of this nation. And that if you are Indigenous, it's not something I could ever begin to understand,
Yep.
And that's what I said earlier, before the break, which is that, many groups, many of us, we can talk about oppression, like I said, whether it's immigrants, newcomers, whether it's folks with disabilities or LGBTQ, and, many other marginalized groups that are marginalized. I would venture out to say that none of those groups, and maybe this is a very big claim I'm about to make,
Go for it.
but I would venture to say that none of us in our own groups that we're grouped in have the level of oppression daily within structures where you look around and other than perhaps some of the rural communities where Indigenous folks are, even structurally oppressed inside those few areas of this province and country. I would say if you don't see yourself here and everything you had has been taken away from you, I don't think any of the other groups have had that level of oppression.
No. And
And
we just
again,
have to
I
look
don't
at
wanna-
residential schools.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's bad to put a hierarchy on, which group is oppressed more, and I know that's probably not politically correct, but I think this is the responsibility of everyone else who is not an Indigenous. We cannot hide behind our own groups of oppression. That is part of our living, and that is part of our journey. But all of us have the responsibility to really, really continue to work on reconciliation, because I don't think there's anything like it. I don't think there's anything like it in Canada.
And I think part of what you're saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but part of what you're saying is that the experience of the Indigenous person in Canada has been such that we would have a hard time finding anything in our history that allows us to understand on a personal level what they've gone through, and therefore our only position has to be to listen.
Yeah.
And hear.
And also what continues to happen within these structures that are outside of their own making.
Yeah.
And so that's the part that I think many of us, when we're doing reconciliation, we find it hard because how are we going to dismantle? How are we going to take down these high rises in downtown Vancouver? We're not. They're here. These pillars, these systems, these structures are here to stay. So what does reconciliation in that gray zone look like?
Well, part of what it looks like is giving land back. And I know that there is a wide triangle of land that's been given back to, I don't remember which nation it is, but it's been given back, and they are about to build very high rises there.
I think land back is a great movement.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, it is.
Something we can all get behind. But having said that, I mean, I think many Indigenous leaders and knowledge keepers who I have listened to, when they speak, and what I also hear from them is a tremendous amount of, just kindness and compassion and humility. Like many leaders, I've heard them say, look, tell us about your culture. Like, we can all live together. We can all move forward together. And I just, I'm always blown away by that level of generosity by some of the speakers I've had the privilege of just sitting and listening to. I'm like, oh my God, you mean with everything that's happened, you are still coming from a place of saying, welcome. Like, let's do it all together. Let's figure out how we're going to work together. I'm just like, wow. It's just it's a testament to the culture, the deep culture that colonizers were not able to take away from Indigenous people.
Absolutely. It also is a testament to their ability to be respectful even to those who come from a long line of people who harm them. It's
and the resiliency. I mean, again, we are two non-Indigenous women speaking, and so I want us to acknowledge that and also recognize that we have the privilege of sharing our hearts and our voices and would be open to if there was anything we said that was offensive and hurtful, that we would be willing to be learners from that. But when I think about Indigenous people, we talked a lot about how difficult it is, but it's also the resiliency. Like, in my mind, the culture that was in the bones of this land before colonizers came in here is still alive. The culture and the teachings are still there, and that is something that I think I often learn from when I sit and listen, and I incorporate in my own thinking and in my own way of being, because I feel like it's a gift. I've been gifted with that.
Yes.
So the resiliency is something we also want to really acknowledge.
Absolutely. I second everything you say. I was off thinking about something else, but the resiliency of their culture has been absolutely established at this point. But I wanted to second what you said about resiliency, and also that, we are two non-Indigenous people here talking about reconciliation, and it is our job to listen and to learn and to keep owning our mistakes and to be humble. And so, yes, if anything we've said is harmful or hurtful, or you just want to correct or give us another way of looking at it, please don't hesitate to contact the radio station or us and let us know. Be happy to listen.
Yeah, thank you, Bernadine, for saying that. I too I'm exactly in the same boat as you. Would be happy to get any feedback.
You're welcome. And thanks for spending this hour with me, Ninu. It went by so quickly. I can barely believe that I have to say we need to stop. So
thank you for again giving me this opportunity, and keep up the good work.
Oh, thank you. You too. And that's our show. Ninu Kang from EVA and I wanted to discuss and work on issues around racism without requesting that someone who is First Nations teach us. No doubt we didn't do it perfectly. I have come to realize that the journey through anti-racism is an ongoing process of unlearning. If you want to join this conversation by adding how you feel and what you have learned in your journey of anti-racism, we would be happy to hear from you. And again, if we have said anything that is hurtful or naive, we are open to hearing that too. Rethreading Madness is now available to listen at your convenience as a podcast. You can find us and download episodes by using any web browser and Googling Rethreading Madness podcast. I have enormous gratitude for Ninu Kang and her willingness to jump into this conversation with me. Not everybody would. My thanks to Sherry Ulrich, who sings us into and out of every show, but as always, my thanks goes out to you for joining us today. Stay safe out there. I'm Bernadine Fox, and you've just listened to Rethreading Madness, the podcast that dares to change how we think about mental health. We air live on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM, every Tuesday at 5 p.m. or online at coopradio.org. If you have questions or feedback about this program or want to share your story or have something to say to us, we want to hear from you. You can reach us by email, rethreadingmadness@coopradio.org. If you enjoyed this show, subscribe so you don't miss the next episode.
I've never been further from knowing what the hell I'm gonna do when I can't seem to find my way under or over or through. Just when I'm ready to give up the fight, there you are when we turn out the lights, and it's alright, it's alright. Don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Yeah. Why don't I wonder how you know? Well, surely you don't have all of the facts. You could be just making it up. Why don't I ever think of that? It's some kind of magic in the words that you breathe, saying, baby, take it from me. It's alright, it's alright. Don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Everything's gonna be alright. With anyone else, it's such a cliche, just words people say to be nice. Or some